celebrate Jason's 11th birthday with his family party. We preface today's celebration with the first part of the interview of our dad and Poppy so that we can have a permanent document of his life. Since I'm the oldest, I am going to ask questions about the early life. So I'm going to start with Poppy Geiger and asking about his background. That's Lou's father, Calvin, and let's see how he wound his way to the United States.
Jane, my father was the youngest of 5 children. Several had passed away. There were 2 boys and 2 girls, there were 2 girls and 3 boys. And after my grandfather and grandmother passed away, my father went to live with his sister, my aunt, in Fiume. At that time, Fiume was a part of Austria-Hungary. My father was a printer by trade, and he wasn't too happy with his circumstances in Fiume, and he wanted to get out on his own. I imagine he was only around 18, 19, or 20 at the time, so he took a job with the Cunard shipping line, that's with the passenger line, and he sailed as a steward. He sailed all through the Mediterranean, parts of Europe, and the United States. Well, at that time, trouble began to start in Europe with the Kaiser's ambitions and with the German manifestation of power. He didn't want to go into the army, and he knew he was going to be conscripted. So he jumped ship in New York City. He walked around the streets, and he had absolutely no money in his pocket. He had left everything aboard ship. He saw a policeman on the corner who looked very, very German. He walked over to him, and he spoke to him in German, and the policeman responded, and he explained his situation. So the policeman felt very, very sorry for my father, very sympathetic, and he reached into his pocket and he gave him $1 or maybe $2 and some change, and he gave him an address and directions on how to get there. The family ran a boarding house of Hungarians and Germans, and he assured my father that this man would take good care of him. He gave my father directions on the subway, and my father found this place, and that is how he got started in America. This man, Mr. Lenches, got my father a job in a furniture factory, and my father became a student or an apprentice in furniture refinishing. That's how he got his start here in the United States.
And how he switched from printing to woodworking.
That was yes. Mm-hmm. Well, in those days, you didn't go for what you wanted. You went for what was there.
Was. Okay. About what year are we talking, Dad?
1908, 1909, 1910.
Mm-hmm. What became of all his brothers and sisters?
Well, the one sister lived in Fiume. She had several children. He lost track of his brother here in the States, and he also lost track of the other brother and the other sister. But there is a record of it, which we have somewhere, and I assume that my father got all this information from his sister. But when World War I came along, your lines of communication were practically nil. The only way you could communicate was through mail, and your mail service was very inadequate. When World War I broke out, there was absolutely no communication. And Fiume, at that time, was moved between Italy and Yugoslavia. It was, I think it was on the Adriatic Sea, and I think it finally ended up with Yugoslavia. In fact, I think it still belongs to Yugoslavia. It was quite a seaport at the time. So he just lost track of them, if not then, a little later.
How did he manage language in the United States?
Well, my father had a knack for picking up languages. He was very fluent in German and Hungarian. In fact, the Weckermans always said that he spoke book German, and he had absolutely no problems with either one. In fact, the equivalent of high school, German was a mandatory language in Austria-Hungary at that time. And he picked up Italian when he lived with his sister, and then he picked up a little bit of Spanish, some Polish, and of course a little bit of English when he traveled around with the liner. And then one of the first things he did when he came over to this country was go to night school to learn English.
Okay. Well, how about Nanny Geiger?
Nanny Geiger came over as an au pair. But before that, Nanny Geiger lost her mother and father very early in childhood, I think in the first or the second year, and she was raised by an aunt. And when she reached her teens, some of the relatives, not her aunt or the friends, tried to arrange a marriage for her with some man who was very much interested in my mother, but she wanted no part of him. So she decided to come to America at the first opportunity, and our understanding is that the aunt arranged the details. So she came over first class to a family in Cranford, New Jersey. Their name is the Christies. And to this day, no, well, not to this day, but I know during the war with your mother, I visited the Christies, and before then, I visited there quite often, and we were always in communication. And it wasn't until until the Christies passed away that we just lost track of them. But my mother was very well liked with them. In fact, I remember one of the children, the Christie children, was retarded, and she took an instant liking to my mother, and she liked. This relationship continued on when this girl became an adult.
Approximately what year did Nanny Geiger come over?
I think it was in the 1910, 1911, right around that time.
About the same time as Poppy Geiger then?
A little bit after.
Okay. And what year was Poppy Geiger born?
1886.
And Nanny Geiger?
1888 or 1888.
Okay. And so neither one came to Ellis Island?
Neither one, no.
Okay. Well, what kind of life did they make for themselves here? And how did they eventually wind up meeting?
Well, as I stated earlier, Nanny Geiger was very, very happy with the Christies, and my father, well, he got along. He went to night school. He was very devoted to his trade, and he wanted to become a citizen and wanted to settle down here. And apparently they met through some Hungarian church or some Hungarian German organization, there were very many of them around at that time.
Well, that was very common in those days. That was in the wave of immigrants from that part of Europe. So
Janie, let me go into a little bit of background more of my father. I think I stated earlier he was a printer. He was very good in high school. He was a very friendly man. He always told me that both his brothers were at least 6 feet tall, and he was the only shrimp of the runt in the family. And I guess I carried that on. But a little bit more about my father. He was a very firm believer in education, and that was prime with him. And I can remember, as early as the 4th or the 5th grade, having my father talk college to me at that time. And not only in education, he was a very skilled man, highly underrated because of his background. He would putter around in that basement with his hands. He would do wonders with wood and with artworks. He loved to paint in his own way. But of course, none of that interested me. I was interested in baseball, football, cowboys and Indians and so forth.
golf.
Golf came much later. But my father was very well liked in the neighborhood. He was a lifelong Democrat. Jane will love to hear that.
Joan.
I'm sorry, Joan. The only time that he ever voted Republican was for Wendell Willkie, and that was because he felt Wendell Willkie would keep us out of the war. But he regretted his vote 1 week afterwards. I remember him saying so. He retired early because, well, he made one big mistake. when we lived in South Plainfield, he would commute to New York City, and he had a very good job as a gilder. A gilder is the most highly specialized type of refinisher in furniture and picture frames and expensive furniture and that sort of thing. He decided, he was talked into taking a job locally in South Plainfield so that he wouldn't have the big commute. See, when he commuted to New York, he would leave at 5:15 after 5:30 in the morning, and he wouldn't be home until 6:30, 6:45. It was a long day.
How did he get there?
Through the commute on the Lehigh Valley Railroad. The Lehigh Valley Railroad to Penn Station.
Where did he even get that? Was there a stop in South Plainfield?
Yes. Oh, South Plainfield was a big stop because South Plainfield was a place where, in those days, all the trains ran by coal, and they had a coal refueling station there. But anyway, he decided to take a job in South Plainfield. But it was in a factory, and it was just painting walls, painting machinery, and items, equipment and such, and he didn't like that. So then he tried to go back to this big firm in New York, but the firm had hired someone else. And you just didn't do that in those days. You just didn't quit and expect to be taken back. So then he got a job with Newark Art Lamp, much the same type of work that he was doing, but only in Newark. And he commuted. Then, of course, well, just prior to that, now see, in South Plainfield, my father's salary was almost twice that of all the neighbors. Most of them worked on the railroad. He had a very good salary. He was earning over $40 a week, which was terrific. Then the Depression came along. And with the Depression, naturally, people weren't interested in expensive lamps, expensive frames, and that sort of thing. So he lost his job. And then it was just hit or miss. He would get a job with one company for a little while, and then they would their inventory would run up, and then he'd be laid off. But when he worked at these factories, he would always become friendly with some younger person. And I can remember one man, Frank Fuller. Oh, he was quite a baseball player, but he raised pigeons as a hobby, racing pigeons. And he would bring the pigeons over to our house at night. And the following morning, at a given time, 10 o'clock, 9:30, or whatever time he designated, I would have to release the pigeons, and they would fly around over the house 2 or 3 times and then head for home. And he would time them when they arrived. They had all little rings around them, by name and by number. It was quite fascinating. Then I remember he had another friend, Frank Policastro, who would come to the house, and he was an avid baseball player. So my father always had friends coming in. And then, of course, after my father lost his job, then it was just hit or miss. Finally, it wasn't until just before the war started that he got a job that paid, I guess, half the salary that he normally paid, and than he normally received. And that's where he stayed for at least a good 15 to 20 years. And my father was a very active unionist. He was all for the unions because of the conditions that existed in the industry at that time. Well, I can relate one incident where he carried a watch. I still have it. And the watch had an alarm on it. So when he would go to these union meetings and they would start to get out of hand, he would press a button and the alarm would go off. And when the alarm would go off, everybody would laugh and they'd say, Geiger's got to go home. If he's got to go home, we got to go home. And it would break the meeting up. But anyway, he was very, very instrumental in getting a union into that shop. And just as a little sideline of that.
Where was the shop now? This is the
New York City.
Okay, back in New York City.
Back in New York City, yeah. And one more little story about my father. After the war, the company, or the union, remember my father was a strong advocate of unionism, decided that every factory, every place should employ some soldier coming back, some GI, and teach them the business, and they would share their time. So to be sure that the soldiers would have, the returnees would have a job. Well, this worked fine. Now, there was a week's work there, so 3 days my father would work, 2 days the other man would work, then they would switch, 2 and 3. Well, this went on for around a month, and my father noticed he was only working 1 day, and the other man was working 4 days. Then finally, they didn't even call my father in 1 week. Then my father found out that the GI that was learning the trade was a relative of the shop steward. So one morning, my father was due to come in on a Monday. Now, in the painting, refinishing business, it is traditional that the man that paints, the man that refinishes, mixes the paint. Now, that's the secret. The secret is in mixing the paint. Anybody can spray. Anybody can touch up with a brush, but they can't mix the paint. Poppy Weckerman also knew that. So one morning, my father's phone rings, and the owner of the place says, "Geiger, why aren't you coming in? It's your day to come in." No, he says, "Where's the paint?" And my father says, "What paint?" He says, "Well, this apprentice, whatever his name was, Charlie or Joe," he says, "he can't work without the paint." My father says, "That's right." He said, "Well, what do you mean?" He says, "Look, you've been working him 4 days a week, me 1 day, 2 days a week. The man has been taking all the time." And he says, "The rules of my profession are he who paints mixes." They had to fire the man. But Poppy Geiger had a lot of spunk in that respect.
Well, we're getting a little bit ahead of our story here, so let's backtrack a little bit to the early years that Nanny and Poppy Geiger were married. Where did they live? Where did they start out?
Well, we lived in, my first recollection was living on 3rd Avenue.
In New York?
In New York City. 3rd Avenue, 3739 or 3971, way up in the Bronx. And our apartment was right alongside of the 3rd Avenue L. And I can remember looking out the window, particularly I was very fascinated at night when the elevators would go by, and the elevator was no more than 10 feet from our room. And with the lights in there to see the people, I can remember that as a very, very young kid. And then I also remember that one front room, I guess there was no heat in there, but it was awful cold, and I used to be scared to go in there because we had a rug with a wolf's head on it. And I must have been only around 4 or 5 years old. I couldn't have been 5. Well, and that used to frighten me.
What language did you speak in those days?
Well, my mother and father wanted to speak English. My father wanted us to learn German. Oh, he tried so hard. But my mother didn't. She could understand German, but she didn't speak it. So most of the language that was spoken was English, or I should say, yes, English. And then when they didn't want us to know what they were talking about, they would speak in Hungarian.
Did Aunt Carolyn learn any Hungarian?
Aunt Carolyn probably learned more Hungarian than all of us. But to repeat, my father tried. I remember him taking me aside, "Eins, zwei, drei," and that was it. I had no incentive or no reason to want to learn German. And I can remember one other big incident. I was playing around in the yard, in the backyard there, and I fell. And I must have given myself a big, deep cut because I know I was very sick. I must have been sick for around a month, and I couldn't even walk. And I remember my mother nursing me and taking care of me. And I still have an awful big scar on my thigh that's the size of almost a $50. But I have very little recollection of living on 3rd Avenue. Then we moved to 1 West 128th Street. Well, that is the first townhouse. It was a big townhouse, one of those gray stones that had been converted into apartments off 5th Avenue. And I remember 5th Avenue parades going by. And then I remember playing in the courtyard. Now, this home was located right next to the Collier brothers. The Collier brothers are the famous recluse brothers that barricaded themselves, and they had a big iron rail fence. And I was playing there, and I don't know, my ball must have gone in there, and my head got stuck in the bars, and I couldn't get it out. And I was frantic. But Carolyn managed to get my head out. And I went to school there in the 1st grade. And Our Lady of Mount Victory, or I think that was the name, it was a parochial school in the 1st grade. And I can remember sitting in, we had benches, we didn't have seats. And there must have been around 40 or 50 kids in the class. And in the spring, I lost my books, or I lost a little bookcase that carried my books and my papers in, and I didn't have a sister. I had a late teacher, and she told me to go. I had to go to the whole school from the first grade right on through up to the 8th grade, knock on the door, go over to the teacher, and tell the teacher they had an announcement to make. And my announcement was that I lost my books, and I had to describe the fold, and if anyone found them, return them to the first grade. And I can remember it was routine. I wasn't scared. But when I got to the 7th and the 8th grades, the big boys would clap, and they thought it was fun to have a little kid come in. And another recollection was at the end of the year, something somewhat like St. Mary's, we would have plays. And our play was, we were all policemen. And every 10th policeman or so was dressed in white, and the rest had to be dressed in blue. And I can remember singing the songs and how impressed I was that I was one of those that was selected to be dressed in white. Then we moved to South Plainfield in 1922.
Well, let's ask a few more questions about New York first. So as a kid growing up in New York in those days, obviously there wasn't the same cars, traffic, etc. It was a much milder city. It was kind of a nice city in those days.
Oh, it was very nice.
But you still had to play in the vacant lots, the city sidewalks.
The city sidewalks, and when we lived on Third Avenue, I remember my father taking me to Van Cortlandt Park. It's still there. He would take me there on Sundays, and he would take me on the subways. I loved to ride the subways.
You could ride the subways.
In those days it was tremendous. And but when we lived on 1 West 128th Street, I had a big courtyard to play in the front. And there was a vacant lot, it wasn't too big, in the back with a little shack in it. So I had no problems playing. No, we were near Yankee Stadium, but I never went to Yankee Stadium. Very, very close to Yankee Stadium and the old polo grounds. Very good, Tom.
Dad, on your baptismal certificate, your name was written in Latin.
Ludwigum.
Any reason why?
No, I don't know. I was supposed to be named Louis. That I know. But maybe the priest did it, or maybe my father at the last minute said, no, he's not Louis, he is Louis. And that was their interpretation of it, unless Ludwig is, Ludwigum or whatever it is the German equivalent of Louis.
Was there a special Hungarian Catholic church that you remember?
Yes. It's on the baptismal certificate. I think it has burned down since then.
Do you remember any special foods, traditions, celebrations, etc., that would show that your parents were trying to keep the customs of the old country, or was it really their desire to blend into the new country?
Both. Both. But my father loved his pig's feet. He loved pig's feet with the hardened soup in it, and he loved a lot of Hungarian dishes and German dishes. Now, stuffed cabbage was probably his favorite. The cooking, my mother's cooking, was almost the same as Nanny Wicken's. Almost the same, except there may have been a little bit more paprika in it. Joyce would appreciate that.
Yeah, I love paprika.
And the way my mother, of course, if we're getting ahead of ourselves, we're going into South Plainfield now.
Well, we're moving there, right.
Well, that's when I remember more about the cooking. Do you want me to go into that now?
Well, how old were you when you moved to South Plainfield?
7, and I was going into the second grade.
All right. Well, why did you move to South Plainfield then?
Because my father realized, and my mother and father both, that the city is no place to raise a family.
So, Aunt Carolyn was a couple of years older than you at that point.
Aunt Carolyn was probably in the second grade. She was in the 5th grade.
And Aunt Elizabeth was?
Didn't go to school.
Was a preschooler. Okay.
Or she started school the next year.
Well, what did South Plainfield look like in those days? Do you have
Beautiful.
early memories?
My first recollection of South Plainfield was when we came in. My father hired the moving van left. It was on a Saturday. It left New York City about the same time we did. And we took the train, and then we took a taxi from Plainfield to South Plainfield. We're seeing the lake. And the lake at that time had a white fence around it. And then I remember coming in, and our house was almost finished. We moved in before the house was entirely done. But the plumbing was in, the electricity was in. There was there was some masonry work to be done. And I remember being fascinated by seeing cows. an open field, and all the open fields, which is something we had never seen except in a park.
It's
And
hard
the
to
lake.
imagine cows in South Plainfield. Where were the cows?
The cows were there until even after the war. That's how people with the Cactus had a cow. The Lingers had a cow. The Vicariages had a cow. The Fahiras, I don't think the Fahiras had a cow. But most of the people there, the Wilbuskis had a cow. That's how they got their milk.
What did Main Street look like in those days?
In South Plainfield, there really wasn't any. Front Street, where Grand School is, was one of them. Hamilton Boulevard was another one. And the end of South Plainfield Avenue. And that was it. There couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 little stores.
Was there a post office?
There was a post office. No delivery.
Oh, you had to go get it?
You had to go get it, yeah.
How did most people move around in those days? Cars, foot, bus?
By foot.
By foot.
There was a bus, they called it a jitney bus, that went to Plainfield on the hour.
Where I get it from.
And I think the fare was 10 cents one way. But South Plainfield was an industrial town. Spicer Manufacturing Corporation, that's where Cornell Dubelier was, dominated the town. It was a very well paying place to work. And most of the people many of the workingmen from Plainfield, rather lived in Plainfield, and would, drive back and forth. And that was where my father, as I mentioned earlier, got a job painting, but he didn't take it. And I'm getting ahead of myself. When South Plainfield left, when Spicer's left in 26 or 27, the town just collapsed because there was nothing there. So we're going helter-skelter, but I think it'll all fit in.
Well, Dad, how did Nanny Geiger feel about moving to South Plainfield, and are there any things missing from her background that we need to know before we go on?
Well, there's probably a lot missing, Jane, but she loved it. She took to South Plainfield as though she were a native. And my mother had a knack, which I think carries on to Joyce very much. Everybody just took a liking to her. Not only people, but animals. That definitely is not Joyce. But Nanny Geiger had she was a very good listener. And people, neighbors, friends, and particularly, it's odd, it wasn't the Hungarian or the Polish people in the neighborhood that really took to my mother. It was the Americans. It was the English. They just loved her. And my mother copied a lot of their cooking habits. And not only the cook, she picked up the traits on how American kids were raised. And then my mother had also, I want to tell you the story about the animals. One day, when this was during summer vacation, there was a big collie dog, and you could see that the dog was a thoroughbred. He had a license number, he had a collar on him. He didn't have a license number then in those days, but he was laying under a tree, and nobody could go near him. He would growl, show his teeth, and we were scared. Then when my mother came home, she was probably in Plainfield shopping, she went right over, just reached over, patted the dog, and said, "Come on," brought him up to our porch and fed him. Then she put an ad in the paper that a certain dog was found. And sure enough, that night, we got a telephone call. And a Victorian man said he was going to come right down with his wife to pick the dog up. There was a reward offered. And he drove in, and as soon as the car drove into Pearl Place, the dog picked his ears up and started to bark. He knew his master. We opened the screen door, and he jumped right out of the porch, jumped into the back seat of the car, and the man says, "Thank you," and drove off. My mother didn't get the reward.
No reward.
But she had she had a very green thumb. She would walk by some of these very well manicured homes in Plainfield and just reach over and take a snip from one of the twigs, put it in the ground, and it would grow. With her garden, she was the gardener. My father had to do the digging, but Nanny Geiger was the gardener. In fact, later on during the Depression, we practically lived on the vegetables from the garden. She would preserve them in the, with the old canning methods. And then I can remember we would buy a 100-pound bag of potatoes, and that was supposed to last the whole winter. And then with carrots, she would put a bed of carrots, put them in the ground, in the basement, in soil, and we would have carrots all winter. But she was very great with kids. There were some kids in the neighborhood that would always love to come over because she always had a little candy for them, or cookies, or something of that sort. When she passed away at the wake, Johnny Pahira came over. He was a golf professional. And I didn't know this because I was away in the Army then. He told me she used to take him to the movies at least every other Saturday in Plainfield and always give him candy. Ronnie Borai and one of the Kafka boys told me the same thing, that they'd always, when things would get dull, they'd run over, well, let's go say hello to Mrs. Geiger. We'll get a cookie, we'll get a lollipop, or we'll get some candy. And they, that was the way she was.
Whatever happened to her siblings, Dad? She had two brothers, and her parents died when she was very young. She was raised by an aunt. What happened to the two siblings?
Did we mention this before? Uncle Steve? No, that was in the tape that was...
Didn't work, right?
Well, yes, she had two brothers that we know of. One was Steve, and he was an actor. And not only an actor, he was a little bit on the, I don't want to say shady side, but he was a rascal, a lovable rascal. People, Hungarian people particularly, would love to have him come and entertain. He could sing songs, maybe he did a little dance, he told stories, and he was full of charm. He was a very short man. I can remember him putting me on his lap and bouncing me, and he had a very pleasant voice. But as Carolyn says, whenever he would entertain at a home, maybe 2 or 3 days later they would discover some jewelry was missing or something else was missing, and they never caught up with him.
What did she say? She had an expression. He was always one step
ahead of the sheriff, maybe. But he had married well. He married I'm trying to think of her name, I can't think of it now, a Hungarian lady who ran a restaurant, one of these restaurants like the one in New Brunswick, in the basement. And I can remember my father taking me there once, and we had, of course, stuffed cabbage.
She was rather portly then.
She was, yes, she was more than portly. But apparently, I don't think he was a womanizer.
But they didn't have any children, no cousins.
No cousins. And he was also a gambler.
Oh, okay.
He was also a gambler.
Okay, well, what happened to him? Did he live long?
No, Steve didn't, Uncle Steve didn't live long. And I remember when he died, my mother showed me a copy of the Hungarian paper, and in big, bold headlines, it said, Steve, he had a stage name, Chungradi. It just came to me, Chungradi, died.
Now, Nanny Geiger's maiden name was?
Androshak.
So he had taken a stage name.
He took a stage name, and he was very well known in Hungarian circles.
Now, what about the other brother?
The other brother, Elizabeth showed me a picture of him in an army uniform, and we surmise that he never came back from the war. But he was also short. I think
in
I
this
mentioned
country or
no, in the Kaiser's army. He must be Hungary, in the Hungarian army.
Nanny Geiger apparently came into some inheritance.
This was later on. This aunt, I think I mentioned earlier that my grandmother and grandfather on her side passed away very early in her life. And she was raised by an aunt that was rather well-to-do. And when this aunt passed away, my mother was the sole heir. And I know I wanted to go to college, and that was what my mother said when she got the letter and the notice. And she says, "Oh, you're going to go to college." This must have happened right after I got out of high school. Well, anyway, I went to the embassy in New York City to try to work this thing out. But by this time, the Nazis had taken over Austria-Hungary, and all assets were frozen. Nothing could leave the country. And I was told to work out a deal where none of the money would leave, but it would be worked out in the trade. big. That is again something.
Dad, back to South Plainfield. What are your memories, your earliest memories of South Plainfield? And continuing to run along the second grade, going from the city to the rural school.
I didn't know what blossom meant, and I couldn't pronounce it, and she ridiculed me about coming from the city, a know all, and that sort of thing, and I felt very humiliated. Well, 2 or 3 days later, I was transferred into another second grade. We had 2 second grades, and I couldn't have had a nicer teacher. Her name was Egan, Miss Egan, and Carmen Helmer was in that class, and that's where I met Carmen Helmer, and I stayed with Carmen Helmer right through high school.
Oh, I didn't know you'd gone through the grades with her.
Oh, yes, yes. But I can still remember that Miss Bray, and for some reason she didn't like me. And teachers in those days, well, that happened.
Just a little tangent here. Is that how you met Art Helmer, through Carmen?
No. I met Art Helmer much later on through the Boy Scouts.
Okay.
When I was invited into the Scout troop.
We'll come back to that. But back to early South Plainfield. What did South Plainfield look like? What was it like growing up then?
South Plainfield, my first recollection was when we came by a taxi into South Plainfield, the white fence around the lake and the lake, the blue clear lake and the open fields, and then the cows. We didn't mention this before, did we?
Yeah, we did. That's okay.
Well, I don't want to touch on it again. And then the openness, the clean air. Even as a kid, I could sort of feel that. And then living in a home of our own instead of an apartment in the city, we had a coal stove or a wood stove. And when my mother would bake bread, oh, that aroma.
Where was the coal stove?
In the kitchen. In the kitchen. Of course, later on it was replaced, and we had running water. Many of the people in South Plainfield, our neighbors, did not have running water yet, but we were one of the first, and we had an inside toilet, not an outhouse. And see, in that little section of South Plainfield, that Spring Lake section, we were the most sophisticated. We were the first ones to get a gas stove. We were the first ones to get a refrigerator. We were the first ones to have a radio. We were the first ones to have a washing machine. We were first in almost everything. The first one to have a telephone. In fact, many of the neighbors would use our numbers when they wanted to use the telephone, or they wanted a call to come in.
Did Poppy Geiger ever own a car?
He owned 2 cars, two old Fords, and he had a problem driving them. And then about the time that he would have driven a car, he lost his job and we couldn't afford it.
Said coal stove. Did you heat by coal?
Coal and by, yes, we had a hot air furnace with the registers, not central air, a register in every room, but no return duct. And the heat was very, very hot and very, very dry. That I can remember. Whenever we would receive coal, when the coal man would come in, one of us would have to stand outside or sit down in the basement and count the bags as they come in, because there was supposed to be so many bags, 23 bags or 24 bags to a ton, and we wanted to be certain that we got a full measure. That was just one of the little economy measures that we had to undertake.
Do you remember what Poppy Geiger paid for that house?
I think it was $5,500.
Well, that was a lot.
That was a lot in those days. Yes, it was close to that.
And how long did the mortgage run? 25 years?
25 years or so, and it was one of those mortgages that was highway robbery, where you didn't have to pay on the principal, but you had to pay on the interest, and the interest was high. Now you have to remember that 1922, 21, 22, 23, and 24 were boom times. In 1926, 27, and 28, our economy rivaled what it is today in proportion, in perspective, in perspective of what it is today.
Mm-hmm. So you moved to South Plainfield. If you were 7, that must have been 1920.
1922. I remember that well. September 22. I had just had my tonsils removed, and at the worst possible time of the year in September, because there was an incidence of kids getting infantile paralysis right after they had a tonsillectomy. Mm. But I had it, and I was pretty sick when we came to South Plainfield.
So you had the tonsils removed in New York?
In New York City.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right before you moved?
The week before, the day before, 2 or 3 days before.
Not good.
No.
Well, back to the grammar school. You met Carmen Helmer there in the good second grade.
A very good second grade.
And you continued to be good in math.
Very good in math. And I went into the 3rd grade. We had a teacher, Miss Garen, and we had a very wild class. We had all the tough Italian and Polish kids from the neighborhood and from South Plainfield that were 2 or 3 years older than us. For some reason, we had 2 second grades, but then we only had 1 3rd grade. And it was a tough class, but I loved it. And particularly, I can remember the games that we used to play, like putting an eraser on your head and running around the room, and somebody had to chase you until the eraser fell off. Mm-hmm. And we would play an arithmetic game. The teacher would give us a problem. You'd go to the chalkboard, and you'd start out, and you'd go you'd make one move, like multiplication or division. You would enter one item, then somebody else would go, and you'd keep going that way. And somehow they would score sides. In fact, that method went on in grammar school right through the 6th and 7th grade. You would choose sides. And I was lucky. I was always chosen very early in the round because it'd be humiliating to be the last one chosen.
Mm-hmm. Dad, how did you hear about baseball in those days? And the World Series and the famous players? Was it radio?
No, we didn't have radio then. Radio came on later on, and I think I'll have a very nice comment on that. No, through the newspapers and through the older people. My mother was very friendly with a Jewish family in New York City, and in the summer, the daughter, Sylvia was her name, she would come out and spend a week or 2 with her. And her fiance would come out over weekends, and he was a baseball fan, and he showed me how to read the box scores and the players. And then I started to read newspapers in the 3rd grade. The funny sheets, I loved the comic strips, and the sporting events and the murders. I remember the Halls Mills case. Mm-hmm. I read that, followed that very, very closely. And I remember there was a tragedy, a ship that sunk, and the Hearst newspapers would play it up big. The Hearst, it was the Daily News and the Journal that we would get, or the American. We never got the New York Times, and I'm kind of glad. But newspapers and sports became part of my life then, but that was a little later on.
Mm-hmm. When did you start playing baseball?
I didn't start to play baseball until the 6th or the 7th grade. And in the 6th grade, I remember, that was the first time that I really started. And I wasn't any good, but in the 7th grade, I blossomed. That's when we started to make up local teams. We had a team from we were across the lake with Mike Vicarage, Mike Kafka, and a few of the other boys would get together, and we would play teams across the lake and somewhere else. Well, most of the time, they would come to play at our place because we had the field right across the street from our house. And we would use an old bed spring as a backstop. And you wouldn't believe it or not, but sometimes a pile of cow flop was a base.
Well, I know you told me that a big treat when you were playing baseball, if you got hungry or thirsty, was to go over to your father's garden and pick a juicy ripe tomato.
Well, it wasn't my father's garden. It was a garden that people from Castle Garden owned the lots, and they would plant corn and tomatoes and cucumbers and such. And naturally, we'd run over. I could go home, but the other kids would go off and they'd just grab a tomato and that was it. Or a cucumber.
And that was your snack.
Yes,
No
and
good
that was in left field.
No good humors in those days.
Now we had the baker that would come around. Now Katz, the baker, he would throw out. He would have a horse and wagon, and he would take his old stale rolls and he would throw them out into the fields for us, and we would, well, not exactly fight, but we would scramble for them.
Dad, what did your family use for refrigeration? Did you have an ice man?
Ice box. We had an ice box at first out on that little landing on the back steps, and the iceman would come regularly, and for 25 cents you'd get a chunk of ice that would last almost a week.
And where did he get the ice from? The lake?
From an ice house. No, from an ice house in South Plainfield, the old Plainfield Lumber and Supply Company. It may still be there under a different name. They got their ice, I think, from Watchung Lake, and they would store it.
What else did you do in your non-school hours besides play baseball and
Well,
count coal?
Earlier, marbles was quite a game. We would shoot marbles, but I was never good at it. We would spin tops. And then my father made a little game of croquet out in the yard in front of us, but we played it like golf. We would make holes. And you would bat the ball and try to get the ball in the hole and keep score that way. And the games almost always involved a ball, dodgeball, a form of volleyball, or we would play cops and robbers. Not cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians. Oh, we loved cowboys and Indians. Tom Mix, Ken Maynard, Buck Jones, Roy Rogers. Well, Roy Rogers came later. But that was our game. And then, of course, playing in the woods, hiding in the woods, hide and go seek. After a rain, we would love to go out barefooted and wade in the puddles. Mm-hmm. And we all have to be very, very careful because of the glass and the tin cans that were around. In those days, you had no garbage collection, and people would just take their cans and throw them anywhere out into the fields.
How about the lake? Did you fish? Did you ice skate?
The lake was for skating. It was excellent. It was no good for swimming. It was too muddy. The only fish that were in it were
Sunnies?
No, not sunnies. Catfish, and some carp. But it wasn't a good lake for fishing. There was boating for a while. Then the dam broke, and the lake was there was no lake. It was all mud and quagmire and swamp. So for a long time, for a period of 2 or 3 years, we didn't even have ice skating. Then the volunteer fire department built a dam, and we did have ice skating. It was excellent for ice skating because I think I took you skating there a few times. We were able to skate from our house, from the Plainfield Avenue, all the way down to what we call Whitebridge, which is only a few hundred yards away from Riley School.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I did take you there.
As a kid, I remember many times. Yeah, Mrs. Letzko took us too.
And the lake was a mecca for people from Plainfield, North Plainfield, Oak Tree, Piscataway. They loved to come to the South Plainfield Lake. It was ideal for skating.
Did you have chores that you had to do around
Yes,
the house?
I didn't like them. I used to have to weed the garden and trim the grass and cut wood. With a little hatchet, I'd have to cut the kindling wood to start the fire, particularly in the fall or the spring when the fire wasn't ongoing. And then I'd have to shift the ashes to pick out the good coals that slipped through the furnace. Mm-hmm. And then I would go to the store regularly. I would go to the store for Mrs. Miller, a wonderful neighbor that we had. And once in a while, Mrs. Lee, that's Tommy Lee's mother, would send me to the store. And then there was a family Ritter down the street where I would cart her ashes over to our house and dump them either in the land alongside of us, or I'd have to shift them, and I would cart her papers, and she'd give me 10 cents, 15 cents, or such.
Did you have a bicycle?
I never had a tricycle. When I started to caddy, I got a bicycle, a two-wheeler.
Well, when did you start to caddy? That comes later?
Until when I was a freshman in high school.
Okay.
You want to stay with the grammar school for a while?
Well, the stock market crashed, and that changed things.
The stock market crashed when I was in high school.
High school, so we are moving up into that time.
But, well, before, I'd like to say what a wonderful education I had in South Plainfield. The teachers were dedicated, except for that one. That was the only one that I didn't like. Yeah, We met John Riley in 6th grade, 7th grade. He taught, I think it was geography and civics and hygiene. And we had a teacher, Sadie Cohen, taught arithmetic. And we had a wonderful English teacher, Miss McDermott. And we had a history teacher, Miss Lundy. But we loved school. We didn't want to admit it. But the teachers, as I say, took a personal interest in the students.
And you walked to school.
And we walked to school and walked home for lunch.
And walked back.
I'm sorry, ran home for lunch. And walked back.
What would you have for lunch?
Sandwich, milk, maybe a bowl of hot soup. And lunch would only take around 10 minutes at the most, and we were off to meet somebody coming along, and you'd run. Playing in the schoolyard was such a treat, because you would meet boys from the other end of town. They separated the boys from girls. You would meet the kids that you wouldn't know otherwise, and that's where you would exchange ideas and stories and capability. You knew who was the fastest runner. You knew who was the best fighter. You knew who could throw the ball the furthest, who could jump the furthest. That was all settled. You never had to have a contest.
Mm-hmm. Well, what happened when the stock market crashed?
Well, we went to, when the stock market crashed, the bottom of our family fell out, and I don't think I never recovered, because then it meant no more new clothes for Christmas, Easter. The meals weren't as good. My mother had to get a job as a domestic, cleaning house. And my father was, of course, he was downtrodden. His morale was bad. And I'm going a little bit ahead of myself. Carolyn definitely was an A student throughout. She was very, very smart. And they wanted her to go to college. And the plan was to have Carolyn go to college, and then it was timed just right. She would teach for 1 year. I would work for 1 year. She would teach, and then she would put me through college. But I think that's going to go into Joyce's territory.
Mm-hmm.
But see, again, I've got to go back to grammar school. We would have organized play. We would have drills, right face, left face. Or we would march. We would march to music. We would have these assemblies in school, and the classes would take turns giving plays, and that famous hats off incident is in there. But there were others. At Thanksgiving time, I can remember once our class had to put on a play about the Pilgrims, and I was Squanto. I was Squanto. My mother could afford it. Then she bought me an Indian suit. So for 2 or 3 years after, even when I wasn't in that class, and that class would put on a play about the Pilgrims, the teacher would always request me to come down and play Squanto.
Mm-hmm.
But those plays were wonderful. At Christmas, we would have one big play where even people that didn't have kids in school would come to see. It was a real treat. Well, you had no other entertainment.
No TV,
no
radio.
TV.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, I've got to say this too. There was the church. But the church was a very, very small church, and we had a wonderful priest, Father Baldwin. He was just devoted to kids. He is the one that really introduced us to baseball.
Was it called Sacred Heart in those days?
It was Sacred Heart in those days. He would, when the big team would break a bat, he would repair it and give it to us, and then he would come out on Saturdays, Sundays, or sometimes after school and supervise some of the ball games. And we loved him. We also had a little basketball gym. It was no bigger than this room, and it was murder to play basketball in there with no windows. But Father Baldwin was great.
Well, I was going to ask you to describe a typical boyhood day. Have you already done that?
Well, you'd have to pick the class. I'd get up and go to school, run to school.
5th grade, Jason's age. In
5th grade, I had Miss Shook. She was the toughest teacher in the school, mm-hmm. But she was fair, very, very fair. And she would take on some of these big Italian and Polish boys and just walk right over to them and give them a crack. And they didn't dare hit back. No, we were scared of Miss Shook. But as I say, we learned from Miss Shook.
So you'd get up pretty early?
I'd get up and dress myself and gobble down my lunch, my breakfast.
What would you eat for breakfast?
Cereal.
Cereal?
It was always cereal, no toast. It was always cereal, no coffee. Kids weren't supposed to drink coffee then. And then I would grab a ball or something and just bounce it around outside until one of my friends would come by, and then join him and run to school. We never walked, we would run. And in the playground, we'd horse around a little bit, play tag or some running game. And then the principal would come out and ring a bell, or a bell would ring. We'd line up by class and go into school, go into class. And then lunch is the same way. A bell would ring, we'd come out and run home, gobble down a sandwich, and run back so we could play Ringo-Levio, Johnny Ride the Pony, or Leapfrog, or handball. As you grew older, your games became more sophisticated.
Mm-hmm.
And then after school, well, you would run to the store. You might have to go to the store to get a loaf of bread, or you'd have to go get a haircut. Santor was the only barber in town then. And then again, run home, get into work clothes, change your clothes. Or you had to change your clothes if you had a chore to do, like trim the grass, or do a little bit of weeding, or sweep something. Why, you had to get that done first. Then you would go out and play football or baseball or such.
Did you have homework?
We had homework, but I was remiss.
It wasn't the major part
I brought
of
my
your
books
day.
home, but I was not. I should have been a much better student than I was.
You never told us that before.
Well, I'm telling you now.
Were there any other Hungarians or Germans, or was it largely Polish and Italian?
It was mostly Polish and Italian. South Plainfield was around, I'd say, 40% Italian, 40% Polish, and then 10% split between. The Hungarians were definitely in the minority, and so were the Germans. There were a lot of Anglo-Saxons here. They had a Baptist church, and there was a lot of Irish. The Irish ran the town, and of course it was 80% Catholic. But we didn't have a parochial school.
When you were celebrating holidays like Christmas, birthdays, were they American traditions, Hungarian traditions? For instance, did you do Christmas Eve or Christmas Day?
The first part, it was mixed. It was both. We did Christmas Eve. Most of the families did Christmas Day. But this was the old German tradition that my father had. Mm-hmm. When we were real little, he would make out, dress in a costume. Not dress in a costume, but we weren't allowed to go into that one room until the gifts were, the tree was assembled. And so the tree was never dressed until Christmas Eve. And then we weren't allowed to eat meat. So we had to have dinner first, and it was always fish or spaghetti or a macaroni dish or something of that sort. Mm-hmm. And then we would open our gifts, and we'd have our gifts were clothes mainly, and always a game of some sort, something to amuse. We had a game.
Uncle Wiggily?
Uncle Wiggily was one of them, and that type of game. You'd spin an arrow, and it would go someplace. Mm-hmm. And my father had taught me chess early. In the 4th or the 5th grade, I could play chess. And, of course, there was checkers. Oh, I loved chess. But then it died out when it got so that I was able to hold my own or beat my father, and it was no more fun. And then I didn't have time for chess because chess was an absorbing game.
Mm-hmm. Did you celebrate with any other families, or was it mainly your own family?
No. Families around the road. But Christmas Day, most of the kids in the neighborhood would come over to our house to play some of these games. And some of the, particularly in the Polish family, the Slavic family, they celebrated Christmas 2 weeks later. Mm-hmm. When we would throw our Christmas tree out, they would grab it.
Did your father make any of the presents in the shop?
No. Well, no, not at that time.
How about Easter? Did you do anything for Easter?
Easter was in the early part, was when you'd get a new suit, new shoes, you'd have your Easter clothes. The girls, of course, would get new dresses and new hats and such. There was a big Easter dinner. Easter we usually had, I'm trying to think, no, I think we had chicken.
Did you hide Easter eggs?
We always colored Easter eggs. No, we didn't hide them. But my mother would put beautiful designs on them because that was his forte.
Well, that's also very Hungarian.
Very Hungarian, yeah.
Where did the chicken come from, Dad? Did you raise them?
Oh, no. No, we would always buy them. We my mother always went to a kosher butcher in Plainfield because Carolyn explained to us that there was an epidemic either in New York City or over in Hungary where a lot of people were taken very ill by eating bad meat. So my mother believed in kosher meat, and the kosher butcher came out of South Plainfield just for us. She was very friendly with these great people.
Did you ever have to kill a chicken?
Oh, that was awful. They brought a live chicken once, and my task was on Easter Saturday, go out and kill a chicken, and I couldn't do it.
So what happened? You had eggs that year?
No, I had to call somebody. I think it was Mike Kafka that came over and chopped the chicken's head off. No way could I hold that chicken by the leg. I grabbed the chicken, but I couldn't do it. And I still can't.
Well, what did Nanny do?
He had some work to do around the house with the garden and with repairs and such. But he had a basement downstairs, a little shop. He would make little designs. He would paint. He would make molds. I remember once he made a big lamp out of a camel. Then he would mold the camel, and he would press it on the side. It was wonderful. And my mother absolutely knew the kind of house she had to wash, the ironing, cooking, take care of the house, and then she took care of the garden. She would visit the neighbors.
Garden primarily served as a
Later on, when she put it in the garden primarily in the mother, he would do the digging. He would have to do that whole garden up. And later on, he bought one of those hand plows. But he had such a long leg that he couldn't do anything in the even in the summer. There was no time for anything. But my mother was very, very friendly with the neighbors and would chat and go to Plainfield and shop.
Did they play cards or go to church together?
My father played a lot of cards with us, but no, and then they would have some little social. They would go visit the Ilks or the Kellermans, or Mrs. Ritter would come over. Somebody would come over and chat. We didn't. People came to us rather than have us visit them.
Well, then the stock market crashed and you went to high school.
The stock market crashed, and then the bottom just fell out of everything.
And South Plainfield kids had to go to North Plainfield High School, and that was kind of a
Well,
new
first
era.
we went to Plainfield High, and then Plainfield didn't want us anymore. But North Plainfield was also, their high school wasn't big. They couldn't support a high school with just their students. So they had the students from South Plainfield pay tuition, people from Watchung and Warren and the Watchung Mountain country. Those people would come in.
How did you get there?
We were bused.
You were bused. What are your memories from high school?
Great. I loved it. I didn't realize it at the time, but coming from South Plainfield and going to North Plainfield was quite a disadvantage because you couldn't engage in any of the activities. Now, when I went out for baseball, I'd have to leave there at 4:30 in the afternoon or 5 o'clock, walk. You'd have to walk to Plainfield Avenue, 7th Street, and hope for a ride, or walk all the way home. That was a 4-mile-plus walk after playing baseball. The football players had the same problem. Later on, they had a bus that would leave at 5 o'clock, or 5:30, a late bus that would take all the athletes home. But before then, if you wanted to join a club, an after-school club in high school, and there were many good ones, you couldn't, because our school would let out at 3 o'clock. Our buses would leave at 3:30. That gave you time just to get acquainted, and well, sometimes you'd have to stay after school, not necessarily because you were in trouble, but to look up things, to walk around, to meet people.
Dad, sports in high school. You did go out for football. You wrestled a little. You played golf.
No, I went out for football, and I weighed around 100 pounds. And the coach says, it's ridiculous, go. So he did something very, very smart. They still do this. They line up 2 people and then a third. And the object is the third has to try to get through the 2. And this is without equipment. So we got there, and the first day came out. He knew me, but he knew I was very, very active. See, in sports, they used to line you up according to size. And I was always 1, 2, or 3 from the end because I was short. But I had no competition with the other side because physically I was way ahead of anybody my size. and my weight. And so he put me up against these two fellas, and after around a half hour, he came to me. He said, "You had enough?" And I did. I was black and blue, and I was exhausted, so I couldn't go out for football. But then in my senior year, our football team didn't score a point. We had a lousy team, and in the middle of the season, the coach was desperate. He wanted just to score a point. He didn't want to go down in history as having a team that never scored a point. So I'm walking down the halls one day, and he stops me. And he called me by name. Now, I didn't know him. He wasn't the real coach. He was the math teacher that also coached. And he called me by name, and he says, "I've been watching you in physical training." And he says, "You can catch a pass." I says, "I know." And he says, "I've been talking to some of the boys. In fact, one of the boys there that you play with in the Sandlots told me," he says, "Why don't you ask Lou to come out? He can catch a pass." So he says, "Will you come out?" He says, "You won't get hurt if that's what you're afraid of." I said, "I'm not afraid of getting hurt." He says, "All I want you to do is catch a pass so that we can score a point." And I held up my hand. I had an infection, my right hand. My hand was around like that. And I says, "I can't." But I would have gone out weighing, 100 pounds, 105 pounds. But I made the baseball team as an outfielder. And I could have made that, had I been bigger, I would have made that in my freshman year.
Dad, you made a lot of friends in high school.
Yes, I did.
Such as?
Well, Johnny Harkness is a lifelong friend. I still correspond with his wife. He passed away. I was the best man at his wedding. Ernie Forbush and I were in every class together, every single class, and there was Johnny Darish, there was Bill Garrity. Bill Garrity's a friend, a good friend. He knows George Lupasakis. I met George Lupasakis there, and any number of people.
T. Broccoletti?
I met T. Broccoletti. He was in our Spanish class. In fact, he used to kid saying that I carried his books was just about it, because T was a big wheel. He was on the student council. He was president of his class, and he was very, very well liked. He was the same Broccoletti then that he is today. You couldn't help but like him.
And how about
Carmen Helmer?
Carmen Helmer.
I got a story to tell about Carmen Helmer, too. In our senior year, that's when I still had hopes of going to college. So chemistry is a requirement. So we had a chemistry class, but there were two chemistry classes. One was an exceptionally smart chemistry class, and another one was those kids who just signed up for it. Well, after the first marking period, the chemistry teacher got so mad. Oh, he bawled us all out. He had given us a test, and he said there were two people in the class that passed it. Carmen Helmer with a 95 and Lou Geiger with a 71. So he dropped the chemistry class.
Johnny Manhattan was another one?
Johnny Manhattan was, yes. But unfortunately, Johnny Manhattan had to drop out in his sophomore year because to support the family.
And was that common in those days?
Yes,
Did that happen?
very, very common. Then they would come back. They would come back later on to play football.
Oh, mm-hmm. And Sue Rabinowitz's mother?
Yes, Gertrude. Gertrude was a straight A student, Gertrude Solomon.
Mm-hmm. When did you get involved with golf and with caddying at Plainfield Country Club?
And in high school, when one of the neighborhood kids one afternoon, we had half a day of school, and he says, "Hey, come on up, they need caddies at the Plainfield Country Club." So I went up, and I started to caddy with him. I was involved in the Boy Scouts, too old during high school.
Well, that was my next question. How did you hook up with the Boy Scouts?
Well, in those days, you just didn't go to join a troop. You had to be invited in and voted in. See, they would hold a little ceremony, and they would vote. Actually, blackboard you. You would turn, all the members of the troop would walk by a bowl, and if you didn't like a certain man, if you thought he wouldn't be a good scout, you would reach in, take a black ball, and then when the man went around, you would drop a black ball. After the black ball, you weren't allowed in. Well, there was a reason for that, because a lot of the boys then were not good company. There was a lot of theory going on. There was a lot of beatings. There was a lot of bad language used, and they wanted to keep the troop clean. And Herb Peterson, I think, is the one that invited me in. He was a neighbor, and I was accepted. We met at grad school, and I learned as much from scouting as I did from high school, and I still use some of the principles of scouting today.
Well, how did Uncle Art come to be your scout leader?
Uncle Art was the scoutmaster. and we had around 4 or 5 patrols. I was in the first, I think I was in the Cobra Patrol, and then from the Cobra Patrol, we formed our own patrol, the Panther Patrol, and I became the patrol leader. And, oh, we had fun. We would put on sketches, we would meet, we would go camping, we would learn the same skills that you learned as a Girl Scout, cook, hunt, or stew, learn how to use a knife, and a bow and arrow, and we would know the name of every tree, almost every bird, all the animals.
Well, that was Uncle Art.
Yes, it was Uncle Art. Art was a wonderful teacher. Art was the second father to every boy in the troop. See, many of the kids in the troop, their parents didn't speak English, couldn't even write their names. And to have a fellow like Art Helmut come along, pat him on the back, and take him in. Oh, this was great.
Tell us about the time you went up to Watchung to go swimming.
Oh, that was in my junior year in high school. And I was never a good swimmer. I could never take to swimming. And I was swimming by myself, and apparently down, this is a surprise lake, there's a ledge. It goes down like this, and I must have swimming around 10 or 15 feet, but offshore, and all of a sudden I went down. And I had to be pulled out.
Who
I was
pulled you out?
drowning. Some unknown came along and saw me, and he started to pull me out, and he started to go under. Then 3 or 4 people had to jump in from the side and drag us in, and I was sick that night.
Oh, I
It
bet.
was an overnight. Oh, I kept throwing up from all the water, and that was a close one.
You also went stargazing in those days?
Oh, yeah, Art Helmut was a great one for that, for the constellations.
And the Indian lore?
Maybe the stars and the Indian lore,
And
campfires.
legends and poems and...
Oh, yeah, well, Art with his stories. And the overnight camps, and we had a teepee out by the old Helmer homestead, and we would sleep there overnight, and then that was great. I can tell you one interesting story. The first hike that I went on was during Christmas vacation, and there was snow on the ground. It was up the old Lions Club in Watchung, and Bob Smith, Carmen's husband, they weren't married, and was one of the senior scouts, and we were cooking we had our own little mess kits, and we were cooking our lunch, meat of some kind, just reheating it, and he reaches over, picks up a wad of snow, and he goes like this. And he said, I bet you think it's snow, but it's snot.
All right.
We have repeated that many, but those are sort of pranks that you would play on one another. The first time a rookie would sleep overnight in the teepee, you would take his clothes and run it up the flagpole.
They still do that.
Well, they still do that. It's the old scout lore.
Hazing.
We had track meets. We had games that we would play with certain skills. And no, scouting, as I said earlier, was as much of an education to me as high school.
Dad, what political or worldwide events do you remember from your childhood and high school years?
Well, Al Smith, I remember President Harding dying, and I remember being fascinated that President Coolidge was sworn in as President of the United States in a home with candlelight. He didn't even have electricity. I can remember that. And then I remember Al Smith. Al Smith was my hero. And
That was 1927?
and that was the election in 1928.
28. Okay.
28. And I can remember writing his name on my books, those paper covers that we had, and I was playing leapfrog, and someone took my books. Well, I went up to class, and then the teacher got a call that I should go down to the office. So I went to the office, and the principal grabbed me, and he said, "Are these your books?" And I said, "Yes." And he threw me up against the wall, and he shook me and threw me up against the wall again, because I dared to put that man's name on my school books.
He wasn't too popular.
Well, he was a Catholic, Al Smith. So there's a sequel to this story. Around 10 years later, when I'm working in the Liberty Theater, that man's name was Mescal. Normally, he was a nice man. But after the box office would close and they stopped selling tickets, sometimes people would come in and you'd just take the money and you'd give it to the cashier the next day, or you'd give it to somebody, the manager, that night. Well, this one night, just as the cashier is starting to close up, this man, Mescal, and another man walk into the lobby, and I'm collecting tickets. and Mike Hafter was the manager. He recognized Mr. Mescal, and he says, "Oh, wait a minute, don't Louis, don't take any money from him, no tickets. He wanted to let him in." So apparently this Mr. Mescal, he wasn't drunk, but he must have had a drink or two, because he looked a little hazy. And he walks up, and he stands in front of me, and he says, "I know this young man," and he says, "This young man will remember an incident, something which I am not at all proud of, and he says, I hope you forgive me, Lou." Now, wasn't that remarkable?
Good story. What other political events do you remember?
Well, I remember the debate over the League of Nations. My father did not want us to join the League of Nations. In fact, most of the country didn't. And in high school, in our history class, the only time that I didn't get an A in history, and I loved history, was when I took the side that we should not join the League of Nations.
Should not join the League of Nations?
Should not join the League of Nations, no. This country didn't want it. They didn't want involvement with Europe and Europe's problems, period. We had the Atlantic Ocean. Things have changed now. Now it's the other way around. That, and then I do remember the Al Smith, and I remember Herbert Hoover, the bad rap that he got. Of course, I hated Hoover's guts, because I thought he caused the Depression, which later on, no way. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt was my idol up until, World War II almost started. And I can remember the governor's races. We had Governor, the one that presided over the Lindbergh case. I remember that trial. I remember the case when Lindbergh baby was kidnapped very well. I was politically oriented through my father. He was one of the founders of the Democratic Club in South Plainfield. And although the Republicans always won, we still were Democrats. Democrats were the minority paper, and the Courier News was a strong Republican paper at that time. But it was a good Republican paper. It was the kind that wasn't radical. Mm-hmm. See, the Republicans in those days were not people-oriented at all. And then again, when I caddied up at the Plainfield Country Club, they were all Republicans, but they were nice. They treated us real good. So there was a kind of balance there. Mm-hmm. But I registered as a Democrat as early as I could.
What was the voted in?
I voted for Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1936.
Do you remember the invention of the radio, or the telephone?
I remember the radio. In fact, there's one story I've got to get in there. During the World Series of 1926, we were playing football.
You were 11 years old. You were Jason's age.
11 years. I was 6th grade, I think I was.
Yeah, that's right.
We were playing football. Yes, it was in the 6th grade, 1926 World Series. I was playing football out on in the street. And John Riley saw us playing out there. There must have been around 10 kids. And he said, "What are you kids doing out there? There's the World Series going on." So he says, "Come on in." And he had one of these old crystal sets with the earphones, and you couldn't hear. So he says, "We're going to take turns now." And we took turns where we would listen and we would tell everybody what was happening. And it was my turn when Tony Lazzari struck out with the bases loaded and the Yankees lost the ball game.
Oh, boy. Mm-hmm. And John Riley was a principal in those days?
John Riley was a teacher. He was the first male teacher we had in South Plainfield. And it was shortly after that we got our first radio, a big, majestic radio that was, it was around 4 feet high and around 3 feet wide.
Wow. What would one cost in those days?
That radio must have cost close to $200, and we had to take it on time payments. My father was still working then. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We were the first people in the neighborhood to have a radio, and I remember many of the neighbors, the kids would want to come over and listen to programs.
What about cars? What kind of cars do you remember seeing, new ones coming out in those days?
Well, the cars that we had were all clutch. You didn't even have the gear shift. You had a clutch. The Fords had an old clutch trick that you had a double clutch to move the car into gear, and then you had the stick shift, of course, and they were very, very hard to drive.
Were they all Fords?
No, the Fords, and there were Chevys, and there were Buicks, and you had more cars then in the market than you have today. Many of these manufacturers are out of business now, and your tires were hard rims, and it was a project to change a tire, and the flats were, well, part of a way of living, and the car batteries would run down to nothing. Many times we would drive in the dark to spare the lights, and your windshield wipers weren't automatic. You would have to reach over to wipe, and then many cars had hoods in the front, a little hood. And you know, that's practical. You could use those today because you wouldn't have frost on the windshield. And then in the
but
summer,
they didn't have defrosters in those
no.
days.
And then in
Or
the
heat.
summer, you could or heat. You could not crank, but you had little rackets, and you would unscrew them and then push your windshield out to get ventilation.
What did gas cost in those days?
I worked in a gas station for a little while, and you would get 6 gallons for $1. Gas was around 12, 16 cents a gallon, I think. And we thought that was high. And oil was something like only 10 cents a quart. But cars would burn oil almost as much, well, I'd say once a month you had to fill it up with oil.
Mm-hmm. Any other political events that you remember, Dad? Silent movies, movie stars?
Oh, I remember silent movies very, very well, because talking pictures didn't come in until 1929. That little South Plainfield theater was it was a treat to go there on Saturday afternoons for 10 cents, and many of the kids would stay in, not only watch the show once, twice, 3 times. They would stay till 10 o'clock at night. Of course, we always had to go home. That was our big treat on Saturday. You had to take your traditional Saturday bath, get up, dress nicely, and go to the movies, and then come home.
Who were the stars?
Tom Mix, Hoot Gibson. Of course, we weren't interested in the real artist part of the stars. Buck Jones, cowboy stars, and then the serials were the great things, where they would end in a precarious position, and then they would take off the next week, and always it wasn't the same thing the way it ended. And they didn't have cartoons yet, but they had you had a newsreel that was silent, and you had these shorts, we call them, where many of the Keystone Cops and that sort of thing. Andy Clyde, and Ben Turpin, the cross-eyed man, and then you had Fatty Arbuckle.
Who were the comic strips that you read? Dick Tracy?
Dick Tracy, Little Orphan Annie, Boo McNutt.
Gasoline Alley?
Gasoline Alley, that was Skeezix, and Moon Mullins, Harold Teen, Maggie and Jiggs. Mm-hmm. Oh, they were great. Your mother remembers those.
What were your favorite books? Do you remember what books you liked?
I'm ashamed. Nick Carter stories, which was trash, and then, the Frank Merriwell series, but they were good. They were all about sports, and the Horatio Alger stories, where good always triumphs over evil. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until high school that we were able to read literature, because we had no library in South Plainfield. We would get these dime novels, and we would circulate them. You would borrow them, trade them from one or the other. Of course, Carolyn would bring good books home, but
you didn't read them.
I was interested in adventure. I love those Nick Carter stories.
Mm-hmm. Are there any stories we've left out, like when Poppy Geiger walked home from the train station in Newark?
When he was unemployed once, that's right, he heard of a job opportunity in Newark, and he took the bus, or he took the train to Newark, and then when he got through with the interview, he realized he had no money, so he had to walk home from Newark.
A lot of shoe leather.
Yep.
Any other stories from your childhood that you remember, or legends, or
well, there were
funny
many,
stories?
but I think there were much too time-consuming, Jane. That we had a wonderful childhood because we were more or less let on our own. And supper, we would never eat supper with my father because he always came home late. And my mother would never eat with us. She waited for him. And then she would wait on us hand or foot. And then you had sort of a code in the neighborhood, like Luke Brennan. His father could whistle. He would just throw a shrill whistle. And when that whistle sounded, that meant no matter what Luke was doing, if he was running from second to third in a ball game, he had to run home. And
was that Lou Ann Brennan's father?
Yeah, Lou Ann Brennan's father. And others had other... parents would just yell, Mike! And you know, you drop everything, you go. Discipline was absolute. There was no questioning parental authority then. That was it. And if you were out of line and you got a licking, you knew you had it coming. You expected it. If you didn't get a licking, then you thought something was wrong. Now, Joan wrote a note. She wanted to know when I had my first drink.
Right.
Well, we had Prohibition, so I couldn't drink. And then when Prohibition was lifted...
Prohibition was 19...
It started in 1919 and 1920, and it lasted through till Franklin Roosevelt became president. That was actually I'm going into Joyce's domain because I worked in the Liberty Theater, and one Friday night after payday, I went out with Mike and the operators, and you had to be 21 to get a drink, and I was 21, just 21, and the bartender didn't believe me. He didn't believe me. He didn't believe the people there. So one of the men, one of the operators, he got a glass of beer, and he gave it to me.
Mm-hmm.
But before then, I had sipped on wine, and I had sipped on beer, and I had absolutely no taste for it. None.
Mm-hmm.
None.
Women's suffrage came in 1917. Do you remember your mother voting?
Oh, yeah, I remember. In those days, the politicians would come around with cars and bring you in to vote.
Because people didn't have cars.
People didn't have cars, didn't have the transportation, and, that's the way.
Was it voting manually? No booths?
Voting was manual, yes.
Mm-hmm.
I'll go into that with the Joycey.
Mm-hmm.
That's more in her.
Two last questions, Dad. The damn goose-did dog.
Well, who did she vote for?
Democrats. Damn Goose the Dog came later on when my father was home, and it was an expression that he used mostly around Billy Helmer. Because, see, we were never home when he was working around the shop. We were out working, or by that time, I had been married and had my own family.
But you had a lot of dogs growing up. Cats, dogs, birds.
We had a dog, Pete. And then after Pete came Nicky, I guess, in the Army. But Pete is the one that I remember the most.
How about Dolly?
Dolly was a bulldog that we picked up, and then Dolly ran away, and somebody else picked up Dolly, and then Dolly came back to us, but Dolly didn't want to stay at our house. Well, Dolly was dog-napped. And Dolly was one of those dogs that looked just like the Buster Brown on the Buster Brown shoes. And it was a very cute dog and a very friendly dog. And Dolly didn't last long with us.
Mm-hmm.
But cats, my mother had cats one after the other. In fact, she called one cat Bruno. He was the bully of the neighborhood. He would beat up all the other cats.
Mm-hmm. How about the fellow you had to box in high school?
Oh, that was...
One last story.
That was... the coach was teaching us boxing. 1, 2, 3, hit. 1, 2, 3, hit. And the other fellows were supposed to move. But as I say, I was down at the end of the line. Well, he put a student, an egghead, an awful nice fellow, but he couldn't lift his hands. He put him way on the end so he wouldn't get hurt. And then when we go 1, 2, 3, accidentally he stepped into my hand, and I hit him, and he went right across the room up against the wall, and he was almost knocked out. So the coach got mad. He says, "You should have known better. He said, I'm going to teach you a lesson." So he says, "Everybody get around in a ring." They made a ring, and he put gloves on us, and the other fellow had taken boxing lessons, and he could handle himself. He was around maybe 10, 15 pounds heavier than I was, maybe more, and a little taller, but he was good. And we get into the ring, he banged something, he said, "Go on, go to it now." And this fellow just kept jabbing like this, and I couldn't do a thing. My face was red, my ears were ringing. Then he stops the fight, and he says, "You had enough." And I said, "No. So, give us a little rest. We're going to have a second round." Well, I had it planned then. So the fellow came out jabbing like this, and I came up with a left from the floor. And I hit him in the ear. And I spun him around like this, and he fell down. And the coach just stopped the fight. He says, "You're impossible." But my head was ringing for almost a week from the pounding that I took. And my face was red and swollen. I almost got a black eye out of that.
Might have been a concussion. Any last childhood memories up through high school?
No, I loved it. I loved it, and except for the Depression, I know I would have gone to college. But South Plainfield was a wonderful place to grow up. It had just what a kid needed. And we had enough freedom and non-interference, and we were naive, and That's the way I liked it.
So, Dad, you graduated from high school in 1933. 1933.
In the middle of the Depression.
Right smack in the middle of the Depression. And that's where Joyce will pick up with the second installment from 1933 till her part ends. That concludes the first installment.
The first of the trilogy.
Now,